Okay, so today we're doing Module 3, Lesson 13, and your learning goal is to use what you know about the size of fractions, so how big fractions are, to help you decide if your answer is reasonable or not, okay? What I mean by the size of fractions is, let me ask you this. Is 1/2 bigger or 1/4 bigger? 1/2 is bigger, right? Or is 1/3 bigger or 5/6?
5/6.
Because 5/6 is really close to what number? 1. But 1/3 is closer to 0. Is 1/3 even half? No, right? So you know a lot already about how big or how small different fractions are, and you're going to use that knowledge to help you decide whether or not your answers to your questions are reasonable. Oops, that's not what I... Okay, when we think about 1/2 plus 3/4, how can we think about it in order to solve it mentally? Well, we know that 1/2 is pretty close, or is it compatible? Could I change it pretty easily in my head? Thinking about your sprint, 1/2 is close to what? Or is the same as 2/4, right? And then can we solve this in our head? Because then what would the answer be? 5/4. Okay, so even though we're thinking about it in our head, we need to write the things down so we can show what we're thinking in our head. Because unfortunately, we haven't invented any technology yet where I can tap into each of your brains and see what you're thinking mentally. So if you write it down like this, it shows me what you're thinking mentally. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, let's pretend we didn't solve it mentally in our head. Okay, I'm going to take away, let's pretend that we didn't write, oh man, okay. Okay, well, let's pretend we didn't write any of that yet. Let me ask you a question. If you just had 1/2 plus 3/4, would you expect your answer to be bigger than 1 or smaller than 1?
Bigger.
How do we know? Well, 1/2 is exactly half. And what would it take to add something to half to make it exactly 1? Half, right? So if I had something bigger than 1/2, if I'm adding something bigger than 1/2 to 1/2, is the answer going to be bigger than 1 or smaller than 1? Bigger. If this number was smaller than 1/2, let's say 1/3, would the answer be bigger than 1 or smaller than 1? So given that we know the answer needs to be bigger than 1, is the answer we got mentally 5/4? Is it reasonable? Yeah, because it's bigger than 1. To fill in this sentence, I know this answer should be bigger than 1 because both addends or both parts are either 1/2 or larger than 1/2, yeah? Let me ask you a question then. By how much? How much bigger will this answer be compared to 1? Well, you just think how much bigger is 3/4 compared to 1/2? How many of you like baking? When you take a half cup, what do you have to add to it to get to 3/4? 1 more fourth, right? Because 2/4 would be exactly 1/2, and 1 more fourth would be 3/4. So how much bigger than 1 should this answer be? 1/4 bigger, because this is exactly half, and this is 1/4 bigger than 1/2. Do you see that? And by the way, our answer is 5/4. Is that 1 and 1/4? It's 1/4 bigger. So we can use all this information we already know about fractions to help us decide how reasonable our answer is. So I want you to think about this problem. Don't find the least common denominator. Don't actually solve it. Just think about it. And think about, will the answer to this question be greater than 1 or less than 1, and how do you know? So the answer will be, you're going to write this in your notebook, the answer will be blank because blank. And the blank is either going to be greater than 1 or less than 1. So we can think in our heads that, well, I know that if the problem was 1 2/5 minus 2/5, the answer would be exactly 1. Okay, that means I need to compare 2/3 to 2/5. Which one's bigger? 2/3. 2/3. So I'm subtracting something bigger than 2/5. Is my final answer going to be bigger than 1 or less than 1?
Less than 1.
Less than 1. So the answer will be less than 1 because you're subtracting something that's bigger than 2/5. The answer is going to be less than 1 because both of those numbers are smaller, or they're less than 1/2. Because both numbers are less than 1/2. If they were exactly 1/2 each, then they would add up to 1, right? How many tenths does it take to take a half? 5. So is 4/10 less than 1/2? Yeah. And we already know that 1/3 is less than 1/2. So both of those are less than 1/2, so we know that the final answer is going to be less than 1. Very good logic. Now, that means when we actually solve it and we come up with something less than 1, we'll know we're on the right track. We'll know that our answer is reasonable. Now, let's use equivalent fractions in our head to solve. Looking at these two denominators, 10 and 3, what will the least common denominator be?
30.
30. Okay. So what do I have to multiply 4/10 by to get a denominator of 30? Everyone?
3 over 3.
3 over 3. Okay. And then over here, well, 1/3, I'm going to have to multiply it by what fraction?
10 over 10.
10 over 10. Okay. So can we do that in our head? That means that 4/10 is equivalent to how many 30ths? 12 30ths. And 1/3 is equivalent to how many 30ths? 10 30ths. And if we add 10 30ths plus 12 30ths in our head, what do we get?
23.
Very good. Okay, take a minute to make sure. Oh, by the way, let's make sure that's reasonable. Is that less than 1? How many 30ths would it take to make 1?
30.
30, and we only have 22, so that's less than 1. That's reasonable. Very good. 1 and 4/7, is that greater than or less than 1 1/2? Greater. So I'm starting with something bigger than 1 1/2. If I subtracted 1 from something bigger than 1 1/2, would our final answer be bigger or smaller than 1/2?
Bigger.
Bigger, right? Because I'm starting with something bigger, right?
Yeah.
Agree? Am I even subtracting 1 or am I subtracting something less than 1?
Less than 1.
So using those hints, think about it and talk to your table group. Is this answer going to be greater or less than 1/2? It's going to be what? Greater than 1/2 because we're starting, our starting number is already greater than 1/2, yeah? And what we're subtracting is less than 1. You got it. Very good. Okay. Now, what would our least common denominator be? 70, right? So what would I have to multiply this side by in my head? 10 over 10. And what would I have to multiply this side by in my head? Good. And we're not going to take the time to do that right now, but I know you know how to do it. If I'm thinking about this and I don't want to solve it, it takes a lot of time, and oftentimes I don't have enough time to finish everything in math. So I think I can do this without solving it. Okay, let's look at our whole numbers first. I have a 2 plus 3. So what do I have on this side?
5.
Okay, so this is the same as 5 plus 1/3 plus 1/5. Do you agree? Okay. So over here, right off the bat, what's my whole number? On the other side, 6. Okay. Well, over here I have 6 plus 7/8. So comparing whole numbers, which whole number is bigger? 6. Okay. Comparing fractions, 7/8 is pretty close to what number? 1. Would you say 7/8 is a big fraction or a little fraction?
Big.
Okay. What about on this side? I have 1/3. Is that a big fraction or a little fraction? Yeah, I think of it kind of like almost a midway fraction, but it's not even half, right? What about 1/5? Is that big or little? So if I have 2 little fractions on this side and a big fraction on this side, do I think there's any chance where if I add 1/3 and 1/5, it'll add up to almost 1? No. So which side's bigger?
6.
Yeah. So do you see how without even solving it, just using logic, I know that the alligator's mouth is going to want to eat the greater side, which is the 6 7/8 side. Do you see that?